Good morning. It is Friday, May the 13th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So after the daily declaration for spiritual warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch, the collapse of parenting, and Hondo from Louis L'Amour. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. And now the daily declaration for spiritual warfare for May the 13th. My rivers of blessing will flow in your desert places. My child, I will cause my rivers of blessings to flow in your desert places, and will cause your life to be a place of deep rivers and wide streams, safe from enemy ships. I will make rivers flow on mountain peaks and will send streams to fill the valleys. Dry and barren land will flow with springs and become a lake of blessing. I will lead you and cause you to walk by the rivers of water in a straight way in which you will not stumble. Behold, my son will call to you, saying, if you are thirsting, come to me and drink. For out of my heart of love, for you will flow rivers of living water. If you will drink of the living water from my son, you will never thirst again. The living waters in you will become a fountain of water, springing up into everlasting life. Isaiah chapter 33, verse 21, chapter 41, verse 18, Jeremiah 31:9, John 7:38, 4:13 through 14. Prayer declaration. Father, you have turned my desert places into a pool of living water and have caused your water springs to rise up out of the dry ground. Continue to open rivers in high places and fountains in the midst of the valley. Make my wilderness places a spring of living water. I will drink deeply of the living waters that I may never thirst again. Amen. And that was the daily declaration for spiritual warfare for May the 13th. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded and asks why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. The biggest mistakes that right-wing talk show hosts make. Number 1, they are neutral. Number 2, they fail to correct their mistakes. 3, they demoralize their audiences. Number 4, they contradict themselves. Back in a minute. Thank you. There's no free lunch. Quote, yet each favor and handout and protection of vested interests shifts the direction of capital and labor artificially, resulting in overinvestment in, say, mortgaged houses, or an overinvestment in corruption. Unquote. Deidre McCloskey. Cronyism is not patently unfair, but it is highly distortive to markets and ultimately leads to malinvestment. We have seen this in unspeakable application with the housing crisis, and yet those who would have the government put their thumbs on the scale of a given sector or industry have in no way been muted. There's no free lunch. Thank you, thank you. And now, The Collapse of Parenting, How We Hurt Our Children When We Treat Them Like Grown-Ups by Dr. Sachs. And we're on the chapter, we're in the section of solutions, and on the chapter about the third thing, which is to teach the meaning of life. Which is more important, achievement or happiness? It's a flawed question. Many parents have heard about tiger moms who are focused on their children's achievements. They know some Irish setter dads who just want kids to have fun. They wonder, should I push my kid harder to achieve, or should I loosen up and let them relax? But this question, achievement versus happiness, is based on false premises. There's no point in pushing your kid harder to achieve if he or she has no goal or sense of purpose that gives some context to that achievement. Likewise, there isn't much point in letting your kids relax and do whatever they desire if you have not first educated their desire. One of your tasks as a parent is to instill a sense of meaning, a longing for something higher and deeper. Without meaning, life comes to seem pointless and futile. Without meaning, young people are more likely to become anxious and depressed. Once children have a sense of meaning, they can pursue achievement with confidence because they know why that achievement is worth pursuing. Once desire has been educated, young people can enjoy free time more deeply and more fully, whether reading a book, listening to music, or taking a walk through the woods, or a fishing trip in Alaska. In the previous chapter, I mentioned the importance of enjoying the time you spend with your child. Schedule a vacation with the objective of strengthening the parent-child bond. That's what Bill Phillips was doing on the morning of August the 9th when he and his youngest son, Willie, climbed aboard a 12-seater amphibious floatplane in a remote corner of southwestern Alaska on their way to some of the best salmon and trout fishing in the world, where the Nishigak River joins Lake Nurka. It would be a great adventure. The plane, a single-engine de Havilland DHC built in 1957, never reached its destination. The pilot, Theron Terry Smith, 62 years old, had survived a stroke 4 years early and was grieving the recent death of his son-in-law, who had died in a plane crash. The group boarded the float plane around 11 a.m. Staff at their lodge called the fishing camp around 5 to ask when the party would be returning for dinner. That's when the staff learned that the 9 people on board the plane had never arrived at the fishing camp. Both civilian and Alaska Air National Guard aircraft were quickly dispatched to search the flight path. One of the pilots spotted the wreckage of the plane. He thought no one could have survived this crash. The wreckage lay on a 40-degree slope. There was a scar on the hillside where the plane had impacted and skidded up the steep hill. The scar was about 75 yards long. The front of the aircraft had been sheared completely off. Then another pilot radioed that he had spotted a survivor. Someone at the scene of the crash is waving for help. That waving hand converted a recovery mission into a rescue mission. The pilots alerted the medical chain of command. There's at least one person still alive down there. But how to execute a rescue? There was no place for a helicopter to land, and time was short. Conditions on the hillside were cold and damp. A doctor and medical support staff were helicoptered to the closest landing spot, about 1,000 feet away, and forced a path to the crash site through dense brush as fog and cold rain blanketed the area and nightfall set in, according to one news report. Willie Phillips, 13 years old, had survived. His father, Bill Phillips, was dead. Willie had broken his foot and had other injuries as well. In the confusion and horror immediately following the impact, which the 4 survivors agree occurred with no warning, Willie realized, first, that his father was dead. Second, that he himself was injured. Third, that the plane was a tangle of debris. Later, rescuers had to cut open the steel fuselage to extract the other 3 survivors. But Willie managed to crawl out of the jumble of the broken aircraft, slippery with oil and fuel and cold rain, and jump down to the ground to wave at the first search aircraft flying low overhead, even though that jump further compounded his own injuries. It's hard to imagine a stress much worse than witnessing the death of a beloved father and at the same time being in agonizing pain from broken bones. No one could have faulted Willie if he had just crumpled into a ball next to his father's corpse. But instead, Willie heroically sought to summon help. Most American parents do not prepare their child in any serious way for disappointment, for failure, for heartbreak. Bill and Janet did prepare their 4 sons, I believe, and that made all the difference. I've mentioned my visit to Shore, a private school in Sydney, Australia. During my visit, I had a conversation with the current headmaster. I asked him the question I often ask students, what's the purpose of school? He immediately answered, preparation for life. That's not a trivial answer. Dr. Wright constantly reminds his teachers, his students, and their parents that the main purpose of school is not to get into a top university, but to prepare for life. The skills needed to get into a top university are not the same as those needed for success in life, as we discussed a moment ago. I said, okay, preparation for life, so what's the purpose of life? Dr. Wright responded without hesitation. Meaningful work, a person to love, a cause to embrace. I paused. That's persuasive, I said at last. I'm not saying that Dr. Wright is a guru. I'm not suggesting that his formula is the answer we all must accept, but it is an answer. And I believe that you must have an answer when your child asks you, why should I work hard at school? And I'm going to stop for this right now, and I got to insert a comment here. When you're dealing with the meaning of life, the thing that he's missing here is religion. One of the things that you can do if you want to, again, bond with your kids, instill in them a sense of meaning, a meaningful life, is take them to church. Okay? Take them to church. And Dr. Wright's answer about meaningful work, a person to love, a cause to embrace, is what life is about. He fails to say, talk about religion, Christianity, more specifically, and that should be one of the bedrocks, has to be one of the bedrocks of your teaching your child. Take your kid to church. Take them to church. If you want them to have a meaningful life, take them to church. So, back to the book. You must have some answers bigger than getting admitted to Stanford or making a good living. Also, I wanted to say, and I'm going to interrupt again here, is he says you have to have an answer. No, it's wrong. You must have the right answer. If you're just giving your mere opinion, then we're right back to why should I listen to you? Because my friends have mere opinions too. Okay? You're here because you have the right answers. So no, just giving them some answer is not good enough. If you don't know, then you have to say, I'm going to find out. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. And then when you do find out, then you come and you tell them what the right answer is. Let's see. Some concept of what it's all about. Some understanding that experiences with people matter more than the acquisition of things. And you must have the authority to communicate that big picture to your child. And again, how do you get that authority is by being right, correct. You have the correct answer. Okay, and you have that reputation with your child. Child knows that they can trust you and trust your judgment. And you must have the authority to communicate the big picture to your child. In order to do that, you have to matter more in the life of your child than his or her peers. And again, how? You've got to have the right answers. You've got to be able to use your experiences and your knowledge to good effect, to help them get ahead, get a boost. Okay, so they don't end up living life learning by hitting every pothole in the road. Okay, or having to go to the library every time they have a difficulty, which is, pretty much the same thing. Go to the library reading books all the time to try to get answers to questions you should have the answers to. The most serious consequence of the shift from a parent-oriented culture to a peer-oriented culture is that parents no longer are able to provide that big picture to their children. By age 10, an American child is more likely to look to peers than to parents for guidance about what really matters in life. But children are not competent to guide other children. That's what grown-ups are for. The shift from a parent-oriented society to a peer-oriented society has turned K through 12 education into a race to nowhere. To borrow the title of a recent documentary, children and teenagers from middle-income and affluent homes feel they're in a rat race trying to get good grades to get into a good college, but they have no idea why, beyond the vague promise of a comfortable job at the end of the rainbow and the lack of any coherent alternative. Without strong guidance from parents, children and teenagers turn to the marketplace for guidance about what counts. And today, the American marketplace, the mainstream culture in which most American children and teenagers take part, is focused narrowly and relentlessly on fame and wealth. In the culture of Justin Bieber and Miley Cyrus, Lady Gaga and Kim Kardashian, fame and money and looking cool matter most. But the pursuit of fame and wealth and good looks for their own sake impoverishes the soul. Being a good parent means, among other things, helping your daughter or son to find and fulfill their true potential. Dr. Wright's answer provides a roadmap for thinking about what that might mean concretely. Meaningful work, someone to love, and a cause to embrace. What work might your child find most meaningful? How can you prepare your child to give and receive love in a lasting relationship? How can you help your kids find a cause, something larger than themselves that they can champion with enthusiasm? The conscientious child or teen is more likely to develop into a conscientious adult, a woman or man mature enough to set meaningful goals and work toward them with integrity, to serve others, and to love honestly and faithfully, to find the meaning of life. So that was the end of the chapter about the meaning, teaching your kids about the meaning of life as a one of the things that you need to do to avoid the collapse of parenting, to overcome the peer-to-peer relationship or the culture of disrespect, I guess is the best way he's put it. And next chapter is going to be the conclusion, and that'll be for next time. And back in a minute. Thank you. And now, chapter 3 from Hondo by Louis L'Amour. And Hondo Lane is a dispatch. He's writing dispatch or conveying dispatches between various places for a guy named General Cook. And so he was set upon by Apaches and found his way. His horse was killed, found his way to this small ranch with Mrs. Lowe, Angie Lowe, and her son. And so he went there to buy a horse and move along. So he's gone ahead and done a lot of work around the place too, because she fed him and whatnot, and he wanted to kind of, pay for pay his way. So he did a lot of work around there, fed the horses and shoed them and whatnot. So now it's nighttime, and Mrs. Lowe, whose husband has run off, she was married, but he's run off and nobody knows where he is, and he hasn't been around for a long time, is now here with Hondo Lane at night, and she's got some feelings for Mr. Lane. So, so there's a little bit of tension here. Chapter 3. She put her hand to her hair, looked around, and went to the door as she heard him stop. There was a moment of silence, then a knock. Angie put out her hand to the door, then took it quickly away. "What do you want?" "I fed and grained your horses." "Thank you. I'll bed somewhere near till morning." She heard him turn away. She hesitated, then opened the door. He stopped and turned, clearly revealed in the light from the doorway. "You can't sleep outside. There's a wind rising. I'll fix a pallet for you in the corner." Hondo hitched his saddle higher on his hip and followed her into the house. Behind him, Sam slipped through the door and sat down near it, looking at the room with bright, interested eyes. Angie turned up the kerosene lamp, and Hondo took in the room with a glance. Her bed and Johnny's were in a small alcove, curtained by an Indian blanket. He removed his hat and hung it on a peg, then dropped his saddle in a corner out of the way. She took blankets from an old trunk and carried them to a corner. She indicated a buffalo robe to him, and he spread it on the floor, then covered it with blankets. She started to bring a pillow, but he shook his head. "Never use a pillow. Only sometimes my saddle. Too soft. Man can't hear good with a pillow around his ears." "But you'll be asleep." "Yes, ma'am, but I wake up easy. This country, a man had better." She straightened the blankets with a few quick, feminine, and totally unnecessary movements, then straightened. Without looking at him, she explained, "It would be uncivilized to let anyone sleep outside. And after all, we are civilized, aren't we?" "Speaking for you, of course. Speaking for me?" He considered it for a minute, then agreed. "I guess you could call me that." "I have to set some batter for morning. I hope the noise won't bother you." "It won't." He sat down on his pallet and pulled off his boots. "Good night, Mrs. Lowe." He drew his pistol from its holster, and with the gun in his hands, he rolled over on the pallet and pulled a blanket around him. Almost at once, his breathing was even and regular. Glancing at him, Angie saw that he was actually asleep. He must be very tired. How far had he walked that morning? It had been just past daylight when he lost his horse, and it had been a long, very hot day. Yet he moved little in his sleep, and she worked, only dimly conscious of his presence. It had been a long time since there had been a man in the house, and it was a comfortable thing. As she mixed the batter, her thoughts returned to Ed. Where was he? Had he been killed by the Apaches? No, he was simply gone, and he might not come back at all. Nor could she wish for him to come back. For these past few months, they had grown further and further apart, and he had worked less and less. Most of the time he was gone, finding some excuse to be away in town. He gambled, she knew that, and he returned home only when he was broke. What had seemed to be love, she realized now, had been merely the natural result of proximity. It was not so amazing a coincidence as Lane had made it seem, for there were no other girls around and few men. They had been together, and it had been a natural thing for them to talk of marriage. And Ed Lowe had got along well with her father. In fact, he usually got along well with people when it was to his advantage. He had deliberately set himself to cultivate her father, for in those days the ranch looked good, and it was growing. After her father died, Ed came to realize that a ranch grows only by the work that is put into it, and he gradually let it go, selling a few cattle, breaking wild horses for the army, and sometimes, she suspected, stealing them from the Indians whenever he could. She had tried, not even Ed Lowe could deny that. She had tried hard, because she was his wife and because he was Johnny's father. But it had not worked, and now he had gone off, and it had been a long time since she had seen him. Now, considering the matter, she hoped he would not come back. He wanted no responsibility. The chores of the ranch nagged at him and irritated him, and the problem of buying cattle and tending them on the range was not for him. Her father had gotten along well with the Indians. Even old Vittorio knew him, and they had done business together. Several times he'd given the Apaches sugar and tobacco, always sure they understood that it was a gift to friends and not tribute. There's none of this feeling in Ed Lowe. He despised the Apaches and feared them. She put the pan aside and went to the lamp to turn it down. As she did so, her eyes fell upon a brass plate set in the cantle of his saddle. She bent closer, suddenly curious. First prize, bronc riding, Hondo Lane. She drew back quickly, startled by the name. Her sudden movement caused a stirrup to fall to the floor, and Hondo Lane was on his feet in one swift movement, gun in hand. With almost the same movement, she had dropped back to where she had put the Walker Colt earlier. Instantly, she lifted it. "You're Hondo Lane." The gunman. "I carry a gun." Slowly, the muzzle of his gun lowered, and he blinked in the light. "Only last year you killed 3 men in a gunfight. We heard about it. 3 men. "Yes, ma'am." He smiled and stepped toward her, reaching for the gun. And in a panic of some sudden emotion, she knew not what, her finger shut down on the trigger. The hammer fell with an empty click. And he stood with the muzzle of the gun against his chest, looking down at her. Frightened by what she had done, she stood helpless while he gently took the gun from her hand. Shouldn't point a gun at anybody when there's an empty chamber under the firing pin. It can be seen mighty plain, especially with the light behind it. He armed the Colt, then dropped it in the empty holster. "I'd keep it that way because of Johnny. Keep it out of reach and with a load in the chamber." He ran his fingers through his hair. "Empty gun's no use to anybody, ma'am. If you need that, you'll need it fast." "I might have shot you." "Yes, ma'am." He turned toward his pallet. "Guess I sort of scared you. Usual noises don't bother me. It's those unusual ones that wake a man." "Sorry, ma'am." He sat down on the pallet, and once more he rolled over and drew up the blanket. He was once more asleep. He still held the gun. Lane. Somehow the thought of his being Hondo Lane had not entered her mind. She should have realized who he was, for she had heard that he had become a dispatch rider and scout for General Crook. Crook valued such men and made every effort to recruit them. She had seen the general when he first arrived on the Arizona station. He had not been in uniform. In fact, he rarely was, and he was traveling without fuss or ceremony. She had heard it said that no man alive knew more about pack trains than General Crook, and he got on well with the Apaches. She stretched out in her bed, tired but wakeful. She had almost shot Hondo Lane. She had not intended to, so why had it happened? What had she been afraid of? She felt her face grow warm in the darkness, and she turned her back on the room, trying to forget his even breathing. Yet she could not forget. And it was a friendly, comforting sound. For the first time in months, she slept without fear, without worry. Outside, the wind moaned around the eaves, and the cottonwood leaves rustled with their dry, companionable whispering. She awakened once during the night and lay awake for several minutes. She had been worried about fuel, and now she need no longer worry. And the horses were shod. He had accomplished so much in so little time. And cutting through the big log, it would have taken her days. If she had to leave, the payment for the horse would help. But she could not think of leaving. This was her home, and here she could eke out a living, whether Ed returned or not. She could shoot, and she had been able to kill an occasional rabbit or antelope. Johnny was getting older, and in a few more years he could take over the hunting, and she would at least have the land to leave him, and she could trade with the Indians. Shortly before daylight, Hondo awakened quickly. He sat up, listening, placing the sounds of the pre-dawn hour. Then he got to his feet and slung on his gun belt, dropping the Colt into its holster. From the window, he scanned the ranch yard. There was a faint gray-yellow light in the east. The yard was empty and still. The horses were standing relaxed and lazy. Returning to his pallet, he folded the blankets, then the buffalo robe, and placed them in a neat pile upon a chair. With a glance at the curtained alcove, he picked up his hat and boots and eased open the door, stepping out into the brisk chill of morning. Lowering himself to the step, he put on his hat, then his boots. The horses came to meet him, and he forked hay for them. The lineback let his hand touch it before it shied away, and then he went to the creek. The water gurgled darkly over the stones with little places of bubbling water where it ran around a branch or other obstruction. He removed his hat and, squatting, bathed his face in the cold water. The creek water was miraculously soft and very cold. He bathed his eyes, spluttering a little, and then combed his hair and straightened away from the creek. The trees were dark and mysterious, and the cold of the morning was bracing and good. A few stars lingered, reluctant to abandon the clear sky to the coming sun. He took his time skirting around the ranch looking for fresh tracks, finding none but those of deer that had come down to graze on the greener grass around the edges of the corral. The garden her father had irrigated was growing, but the few rows were painfully small and obviously irrigated by hand now. Across the creek he saw a clump of squaw cabbage, and there were no broken stalks. He must tell her about it, for apparently she knew nothing of the desert plants on which the Indians survived. There's food in the desert if a man knew where to find it, and the Apaches knew. That was the item that defeated the army. The Apaches lived off the country they passed through, and they knew all the water holes, and could, if necessary, go for several days without water, just carrying a pebble in their mouths. But the Apaches knew the plants that conserved water, too. Hondo rolled a smoke and glanced around the rim of the hills as his tongue touched the paper. Of course, the food the Apaches loved was mule meat, and that meant army mules. An Apache preferred it to any other, with horse meat second, and only after that would he consider beef or mutton. Pork he would not eat at all. Yet there was plenty to eat in the desert if a man knew where to look. Lane crossed the stream and gathered a double handful of squaw cabbage. He was walking back toward the house when the door opened and Angie Lowe stepped out. "Squaw cabbage," he said. "Lots of it across the creek. Mighty good stew when you boil it with meat. Some folks like it raw." She accepted the whitish stalks and put them down on the table inside. "Breadroot out there, too," he said. "And you can grind mesquite beans into flour and bake them into a loaf." "You must have learned a lot from the Indians." "Some," he said. "They've lived here a long time." We walked onto the corral and roped the line back. When he let it out of the corral, he bridled it and saddled it, then went to the house for his saddlebags and rifle. "You're leaving?" "Yes, ma'am." "Got to go on." His eyes met hers. "Sure you won't come along?" "No, this is all I have." "Dam ought to be rebuilt," he said. "Hard to get water in the garden." "If you're going, I ought to wake Johnny to say goodbye to you." Was it me? Lane coiled his rope. I'd let him sleep. Youngsters grow sleeping. But you do what you want to do. He's delighted with the whistle you gave him. It's more like a flute than a whistle. Lane felt uncomfortable. He liked to avoid goodbyes, and this was leading to one. He fiddled with the girth, rearranged the saddlebags. "Learned to make them when I lived with the mescaleros. My squaw used to make them for all the youngsters in the camp." "You lived with the Apaches?" 5 years. She hesitated, but her curiosity overcome her reluctance to pry. "You had an Indian wife?" "Wife, squaw. Took the liberty of borrowing a few feet of rope off that roll in the lean-to. Mine was most worn out. I'll be glad to pay you for it if you'll let me." "Of course not." He tied the rope to the corral post, then to the pommel of the saddle, and moved the horse back to stretch the newness out of the rope. She fidgeted, wanting to know more about but was hesitant to ask. There was no sound from the house. The air was still fresh and cool, but carried the promise of a hot day. As he worked, she watched him, reluctant to see him go. "It must have been interesting living with the Apaches." "I liked it." "This Indian wife you had. She's dead." He spoke quietly, without emotion. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring up an unhappy memory. He turned, letting the horse stand. He pushed his hat back on his head and considered her remark. I don't remember anything unhappy about Destarte. Destarte? How musical. What does it mean? You can't say, except in Mescalero. It means morning, but that isn't what it means either. Indian words are more than just that. They also mean the feel and the sound of the name. It means like crack of dawn, the first bronze light that makes the buttes stand out against the gray desert. It means the first sound you hear of a brook curling over some rocks, some trout jumping, and a beaver crooning. It means the sound of a stallion makes when he whistles at some mares, just as the first puff of wind kicks up at daybreak. It means like you get up in the first light and you go out and you and her go out of the wickie up where it smells smoky and private and just you and her and kind of safe with just the two of you there, and you stand outside and smell the first bite of the wind coming down from the high divide and promising the first snowfall. Well, you just can't say what it means in English. Anyway, that was her name, Destarte. Rather amazed, Angie stared at him. Why, that's poetry. Huh? Didn't mean to go gabbing. He looked around at Angie. You remind me of her, some. He untied the rope and began to coil it again without looking at Angie. Good rope, he commented. Sure I can't pay you for it? I remind you of an Indian girl? Was she fair? He turned and looked at her without emotion. He inspected her hair, her coloring, and her face. She flushed as his eyes went over her figure. Her hair was black as 10 feet down. It shined black like those plums you find up on the powder. You know how the wing of a crow is shiny? Black and gleaming. Tied the rope to the saddle horn. That's the way her hair shined. He tightened the knot. I'd like to pay you for this rope. Dispatch writing, I've got the right to give you United States Army script. You loved her? He hesitated, thinking about it, his eyes wandering toward the hills. He hitched his belt a little and took out the makings. I don't know. I needed her. But if she was dark and I'm fair, why, you remind me? Yes. I don't know. It's hard to figure. I thought about it. You walk like her with your head up. He put a cigarette in his lips. You walk like an Indian. You don't toe out like a white woman. He looked at her and their eyes met. He took the cigarette from his lips and took the front of her dress in his left hand and drew her to him, and their lips met. There was nothing forceful about it. She neither resisted nor helped. Yet she was far from merely acquiescent, and when they parted, her face was a little pale. She stepped back, not frightened, but not sure of what it meant. I'm surprised at you, Mr. Lane. No, you're not surprised, Mrs. Lowe. You knew. I'm a married woman. I thought about that, too. I thought about it a long time last night. She touched her lips with the back of her hand and took another step back. Nothing about it seemed wrong. It had seemed natural, right. Angie was puzzled at her own feelings and trying to make a meaning for them. Maybe I kissed you because you make me think of Destarte, or maybe because I hate to think of your hair drying, slung from the center pole of an Apache wickiup. But a long time ago, I made me a rule. I let people do what they want to do. I got it figured now. A handsome woman like you walks with her head up, ought to kiss a man before she dies. You're very strange, Mr. Lane. He swung into the saddle and the line back humped its back, then settled down, restless, but aware of the man in the saddle and remembering the fight of yesterday. I don't know about that, he said thoughtfully. He then looked away. Goodbye, Mrs. Lowe. She waited, standing very still in the center of the yard until he went over the hill, and even then she did not move, but stood there, silent and alone in the middle of the bare yard. The dust settled into the trail, and the rim of the hills showed nothing but the morning sky, brightening. It would be very hot. She turned, picked up her pail, and walked to the spring. And that was chapter 3 from the book Hondo by Louis L'Amour. Back in a minute. Thank you, thank you. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all of the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers, and reminding you to listen to the John and Ken Show on KFI AM 640, Monday through Friday from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Pacific Time. Also, KFI needs to bring back Brian Suits and his show, The Dark Secret Place. Hashtag bring back Brian Suits. Until next time, be honest, be smart, be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.